All right, everyone. Welcome to our final lecture. I'm excited because I get to present what is my current book project with my colleague, Professor Mary McThomas here at UCI. And the book is called Pitbull Politics, What a Dog Breed Can Teach Us About Prejudice in Politics. And we wrote this book really because we thought it would be a good way to teach people who didn't know that much about race or racism or politics about racial politics and the way that racism operates in our politics through the treatment of pit bulls. And so that may sound crazy, but give it a try. Read the chapter that we assigned for this week, and I'm going to try to bring together a lot of the themes in the course through public opinion about pit bulls. Today's talk is going to be two factors. We're going to talk about the racialization of pit bulls and how pit bulls, their association with African Americans, owners, culture, serves as a real basis for prejudice and discrimination. And then we're going to talk about prejudice reduction and about how attitudes about pit bulls are changing and draw some parallels between prejudice reduction towards other groups. But I want to start off here with kind of this ugly looking graph. I will make that prettier for the book, but I just did not have time. And what this is that on the bottom, which you can see, is the American Temperament Test Society score. So when you have this 5-minute social experiment YouTube video that you watched this week about the reactions to when the dude is walking his pit bull versus when he's walking his Australian Shepherd, they make a lot of note of this American Temperament Test Society score. These They did thousands of dogs, kind of tested them for temperament, how tolerant they were to a bunch of situations. And the x-axis here, these range from 0 to 100. And then the y-axis is how favorable each dog breed is. And so, a lot of overlapping lines. One that you can see over here, this is the Labrador Retriever. One of the coolest dogs in the history of the world, but the Labrador Retriever, has pretty much the best temperament of any dog and is pretty much the highest rated dog along with the Golden Retriever. But when we come down here, we see our good friend, the Pit Bull. And the Pit Bull is the lowest rated dog, despite the fact that it has such a good temperament score. Also notable is the American Bulldog is down here. American Bullies are another breed that often gets lumped in with pit bulls. But in general, you see no real relationship, pretty much a flat line between how good a temperament a dog has and how the public views that. That has a lot of parallels when we think about prejudice, when we think about stereotypes. A lot of stereotypes are constructed in ways that have just no basis in reality whatsoever. Like a couple weeks ago when we were doing criminal justice and I was showing you kind of these percent who thought that many or most African American men are violent, and it was like 60% of whites. No, that is a crazy number. Very, very, very few percent of African Americans are violent, commit violent crimes, but public opinion and stereotypes, because of the way they've been constructed, aren't necessarily rooted in that reality, but rooted in the construction of prejudice. And so then that leads to the question of why so much prejudice and discrimination against pit bulls. Well, it's obviously not one of the factors we focused in on as the root cause of much prejudice and racism in this country and throughout the world, and that is to legitimize oppression and exploitation. And so remember, that was one of the key factors when we were talking about how prejudice, how stereotypes get constructed. And we think about the different stereotypes that got attached to African Americans during the slave era versus during the Jim Crow era versus during the kind of racial resentment or modern racism era. So no, that is something that certainly does not apply here. I do not think a million pit bulls get killed every year because the country is justifying oppression and exploitation of them. That could have some role. Instead, pit bull prejudice is psychological in nature. And I used to teach this in this course. It's a big debate in kind of the academic literature about prejudice. Is prejudice more structurally based in terms of justifying oppressions? That's more the position of sociologists, and that's the position that I've taught you. Or is it more psychological in nature? And I don't think it really matters. I think that prejudice stereotypes get formed and get transmitted and constructed because you're justifying oppression, but then they take root for a lot of different reasons, and a lot of those are psychological in nature. And so psychological theories of prejudice lean heavily on the idea of socialization. How you are socialized to think about race, to think about groups, to think about hierarchies. These typically come during childhood and during late adolescence. How you are socialized to think about race, those loom the largest in psychological theories of socialization. And so when it comes to pit bulls, this socialization account becomes so important for the construction of pit bull prejudice. And a lot of it comes, we'll see, through media negativity and through sensationalized accounts. Because people don't have that much interaction with pit bulls, they rely on other sources of information. And those sources tend to present the group in very, very negative terms. When you actually interact with pit bulls, you realize, oh my God, these guys are awesome. And so the more you interact with pit bulls, the more you like them. For a group like golden retrievers, you don't need to interact with golden retrievers to know you like them. Why? Because you see golden retriever love every single where in the world. Deep in psychological theories of prejudice are also this thing called attribution theory. We've talked about certain aspects of attribution theory, and we talked about ultimate attribution theory. But in general, attribution theory means that we attributed negative actions of groups that we don't like or groups that we're not a part of, in this case pit bulls, to their nature. And so you see this all the time. If you see one individual of a group acting in a stereotypical way, oh yeah, of course, they're all like that. Meanwhile, if you see a member of another group acting in that same way, oh, that guy's just an asshole. And that's the same thing that happens with pit bulls. When a pit bull has some type of negative incident, pit bulls are inherently dangerous. Pit bulls are monsters. Pit bulls are that way by nature. But if you see, I've been bit by every single type of dog. I've been bit by pit bulls, I've been bit by Labradors, I've been bit by Jack Russell Terriers, colleagues. You spend as much time around dogs as I do and you're going to get bit by them. And I will tell you that getting bit by the pit bull was the one that put me into the hospital, but we'll leave that alone for now. But when I got bit by the pit bull, I didn't say, oh my God, these pit bulls are awful. Just like when I got bit by a Labrador, I didn't say, oh my God, these Labradors are awesome. I was just like, oh my God, this guy is an asshole. And that is the difference when it comes to attribution theory. And it works all the time for prejudice. When you see a member of a group doing something bad that you don't like, oh, that's them. You know, and you could do it, you see it in politics all the time. Oh, Republicans are just that way, or Southerners are just that way. Meanwhile, somebody in your party does it. Good example right now would be Andrew Cuomo, Democrat. Sexual harassment. You say, oh my God, Andrew Cuomo, that guy's a piece of shit. But you don't say all Democrats are that way. That's how that works. And then the first part of this lecture is going to talk about how prejudice and discrimination against pit bulls is often a reflection of racial prejudice through their association with African American owners and culture. Which leads me to this, and this is the first part, is pit bull people, the racialization of pit bulls. So you read this chapter from our book, and the chapter begins with this terrible Netflix show, Insatiable, Some of you may have watched it. If you did, it was terrible. I made my wife watch because I like shows about weight loss. That's my thing. But I kept watching it. They had this stupid episode. It was called Bikinis and Bitches. They do this dog car wash to raise money. And in one of their brilliant scenes, they have all of these look-alike dog owners. And so here's this Afghan here. Here's one of those scary pit bulls right now. An Afghan. You have this woman here with the same hair. Dude here with the same hair. Well, that's cut off, but he's got the fluffy hair. Poodle with the saddle cut. And then you got this pit bull here that's just an African-American muscular man in a chain. And that's all you needed to convey that this is his look-alike. What other dog would an African-American man have? That is the nature of thinking when it comes to race and dog owners that I will tell you about today. So how did pit bulls become racialized? What are the origins of racialized pit bulls? Well, one is that hip-hop's unofficial mascot, as you probably know, is the pit bull. And so this year, I'm proud of myself because I got these GIFs to work. This is from Snoop Dogg's first ever video, What's My Name? This great song came out when I was in 7th grade. But in the video, he's got members of his dog pound African-American men actually morphing into pit bulls. Snoop has to morph into a Doberman because nobody would ever believe that Snoop's scrawny frame would look like a pit bull. But you see the morphing of African-American men. You see all types of pit bull breeding in hip-hop. And so other origins, we have hip-hop's unofficial mascot. Also, you have dog fighting and stereotypes associated with that. We'll talk about it. Young black men take up dog fighting in the 1980s and use pit bulls as extensions of social status, as symbols of masculine power, and as tools to intimidate others. And then the person who wrote kind of the definitive account of pit bulls, she wrote that pit bulls symbolize strength, self-sufficiency, and resiliency. Never before had a generation of African Americans, especially the urban poor, connected with a specific type of a dog they felt represented their collective identity. And so this maps on to a larger divide over race and dog ownership. Kind of the pit bull forms an anomaly in that dogs are racialized in many cases as white. So let me break down what's happening here. African Americans, only about 20-25% own a dog. Whites, 45%. Not surprisingly, whites are much more likely to interact a lot with dogs than African Americans and rate dogs very favorably. The racial dog divide is discussed in the reading you have from me this week, has its roots in the history of racism and oppression in this country. Part of it is due to socioeconomic inequality that we've talked about in this course, but other parts are legacies of dogs being used as weapons of repression against African Americans, from slavery up through modern practices in places like Ferguson, where police dogs are used to control and to terrorize African Americans. And then also, African Americans in the South were banned from owning dogs as part of these plantation era laws in fear that they would be weaponized against whites. So all of these factors have led to a racial dog divide where African Americans are less likely to own dogs than whites. But when it comes to pit bulls, there is a difference. So this question here, pit bull is favored breed. 21% of African Americans, just 12% of whites. Pit bull is least favorite breed, 33% of whites, 28% of African Americans interact a lot with pit bulls. Now, slightly more likely for African Americans than whites, and rate pit bulls very favorably, slightly more likely than whites. And so you see African Americans, you see dogs as a whole kind of racialized as white, and this is, as I discussed in that 538 piece, further exacerbated by popular culture imagery of white dog owners. But for pit bulls, at least, there's some evidence, not big, huge divides, but there's some evidence that African Americans like pit bulls more than white people do. And so that link between African American owners and pit bulls is often posited as one of the main reasons for pit bull prejudice. The pit bull prejudice against the dog breed, is rooted in racial prejudice. And so there's this Washington Post op-ed in 2016, pit bull bans are proxies by which uneasy majorities can register their suspicions about race, class, and ethnicity of the people who own these dogs. Claire Kim, our colleague at UCI, she wrote this cool book here about race, species, and nature in multicultural societies, where she discusses the racialization of pit bulls, and she talks about how pit bulls are getting killed at extraordinary rates because of their association with African Americans. And Benedict Boisseron, this is her book, Afro Dog, which is also pretty awesome. She writes that when one becomes aware of the racialization of the pit bull through putative black ownership, pit bull bans across America take on the appearance of a modern version of the plantation era ban on dog ownership. So she's explicitly connecting the pit bull bans of today's era to the racist practices of banning African Americans from owning dogs in the plantation era. But that also begs the question, how much of this is just people like me, people like Professor Kim, making this out into something? Is this real? Is this something that people think about when they associate dog owners with certain breed? And the answer is yes. And I tested this. I asked a bunch of people in a couple of surveys, in a poll asking whether white people or black people were more likely to own each of the following breeds of dogs. So for most groups, so like if we take a golden retriever here, most people think that, like 80% say that white people are more likely to own. But when we get to pit bulls and Rottweilers, pit bulls is basically 60-40. So 60% of the people think African Americans are more likely to own pit bulls than whites. That's actually false according to the data. It's not surprising. You see this a lot when it comes to perceptions of race and things like who uses welfare or criminality. Exaggerations are often made in the public mind when it comes to race. And so all these dogs here, most people associate them with whites, but pit bulls and Rottweilers are the two breeds that people associate with African Americans. And as I write in that piece, it's hardly a coincidence either that the two dog breeds stereotyped as black owned are also the two breeds that evoke the most fear from the public. Over 40% of respondents in a 2018 survey we conducted said that Scary described pit bulls and Rottweilers extremely or very well, but only 10% said the same thing about golden retrievers, colleagues, Dalmatians, and Labradors. These four breeds were all rated at least 15 percentage points more favorably than Rottweilers and pit bulls in our 2020 surveys. And so this connection between Scary, African Americans, certain dog breeds, they all fit in terms of our racialized stereotypes that we've discussed. And as I'll note in a second, they're all going to contribute to prejudice against the breed. And so what we do in this chapter, we set it up that way so you're like, okay, there's something here. You're not totally talking out of your ass. But the purpose of this chapter and this talk is to compare the racialization of pit bulls to other racialized issues. Remember, racialized issues are issues that tend to get associated with certain groups. Crime is not a racialized issue by itself, but because of discriminatory practices that we've talked about the last 2 weeks, crime has become a racialized issue, same with poverty and drug use. And as we know from our discussions of those, When it comes to the media, things like poverty, crime, and drug use are portrayed more negatively when it has a black face associated with it than when it has a white one. Think of our discussion of crack versus opioids, which I also discuss in this chapter. In public opinion, racial prejudice affects policies and issues experimentally connected to African Americans. We talked about this also when we talked about the racialization of crime, the racialization of welfare, and then policy, how policies get implemented. The implementation of racialized policy plays out differently depending on the racial composition of the states and the racial attitudes of its citizens. We talked about this when we talked about the connection between lynching and the death penalty and how the places that were the lynchers are now the places that execute the most individuals. So I want to start with the media story. And so the media story here is going to be on how racialized stories about pit bulls get portrayed. And this we're able to do through this amazing analytics firm run out of Harvard called Crimson Hexagon that codes every single news story in terms of its sentiment, whether it's positive, negative, or neutral. And this is what it looks like here. Racialized stories are stories that explicitly note some form of race, something like African American or Black community, in a story about pit bulls. Hold on. I've got to put a pit bull in his crate because he is annoying me. Here. All right. Sorry about that. So, what this shows here is that these are stories about all bunch of other dog breeds like Labradors, German Shepherds, etc. And they're not that negative regardless of whether they're racialized or not, whether they explicitly discuss race. But when it comes to pit bulls, they're overwhelmingly negative to begin with. But then when you add that race element, that explicit race element on top of it, they're basically exclusively negative. And this recalls something that Professor Kim writes in her book that I think is very apropos, if I can find it. Maybe not. So she writes, separately, the young black man and the pit bull make people cross to the other side of the street. Together, they are a picture of unmitigated threat. And that is what the news media is doing when they cover pit bulls. They cover them negatively regardless, but then when you add that racialized component to it, it's overwhelmingly negative. You get this double negative, and it evokes the way that issues of poverty, issues of crime, issues of drug use are conveyed by the media when they are associated with African Americans versus whether they are associated with whites. We also see a notable link between racial attitudes and attitudes toward pit bulls. So these are measures here of old-fashioned racism, things like how cool you would be with a close relative marrying somebody of a different race. And in each case, the higher you score on old-fashioned racism, the less supportive you are of pit bulls. It is a unique pit bull thing, so it doesn't have any relationship for the average of all other breeds, but things like, do you rate African Americans more or less favorably than whites, or how you score in old-fashioned racism, they are strongly linked to negative opinions of pit bulls. And then finally, this has important implications for how pit bull policies play out across the state. So in the last 20 years, about 20 states have passed these BSLs. They're called breed-specific legislation bans, which means that in that state you cannot ban pit bulls or any other dog breeds. And so these preempt them. And what you can see here is that the probability of having one of these, what we call pit bull protection laws, really declines as that state becomes more racist. And so this is a measure of white opposition to interracial dating in the state. And so states that score low in this, like Maine and like Vermont and Oregon, they're little more likely than not to have passed one of these legislations protecting pit bulls. But as you get to states who scored very high in this, like a Mississippi, their probability is very, very low. This here is a measure we've talked a little bit about also. It's racist Google searches. How often do states, how frequent are states searching for racist content on Google? Again, we see Oregon. We also see Utah pretty low on there. Good for you, Utah. But these states, about 60% of the lowest racist Google searches states are passing pit bull protection laws. But by the time you get out to Mississippi and West Virginia, you have almost no probability of passing them. So we see the same type of racialization patterns occur in policies with pit bulls that we've seen with other issues. And so this is some conclusions of the pit bull people section of the talk. We see these striking similarities between the racialization of pit bulls and other racialized issues such as poverty and crime. In every case, we see media coverage when it's associated with African Americans being considerably more negative. In public opinion, in each case, we see people who score high in prejudice being less supportive of pit bulls, much the way that they're less supportive of welfare or more supportive of harsh criminal justice policies. And the same for policy implementation. Just like racist states are more likely to adopt more punitive criminal justice policies, stricter welfare benefits, they're less likely to adopt the Medicaid expansion under Obamacare. All of these factors come in, and just like that, when it comes to state-level legislation protecting pit bulls, you see the exact same pattern. Now, where we're going to go to this is on deracialization and growing pit bull positivity. And so this next section is going to focus on how white face of the breed on social media is overwhelmingly positive. Public opinion right now is dramatically shifting in favor of pit bulls, and we're going to see how Black and white Americans respond differently to racialized pit bull positivity. Okay, so that leads to the second part of, and this is on the prejudice reduction. Part 2 is on pit bull positivity, changing images and opinions of pit bulls. And so these are 2 Sports Illustrated editions. This is from July 27th, 1987. Late 80s, early 90s, this is what's called the height of the pit bull panic era. People have lost their friggin' minds when it comes to pit bulls, and they are often portrayed like this. These lock-jawed monsters, foaming at the mouth, ready to kill you and not let go. And a lot of this is racialized based upon what we discussed in the second section. And then fast forward 21 years later, and this is the pit bull that shows up on Sports Illustrated's cover. And couldn't be any more different. You have this nameless canine nemesis who's just labeled Pit Bull Terrier, beware of this dog. Meanwhile, you have this really sweet, her name actually is Sweet Jasmine, and so the stereotype shattering nature of Sweet Jasmine. And this is one of Michael Vick's dogs, the Good News Out of Bad News Kennels. If you don't know who Michael Vick is a superstar NFL quarterback. If you know who Lamar Jackson is now, he was Lamar Jackson before Lamar Jackson. If you don't know who Lamar Jackson is, well, Michael Vick and Lamar Jackson are like the 2 fastest players on the field, the most dynamic players, but they're also amazing quarterbacks with tremendous arms and quarterbacking skill. So he's one of the best players in the football. He had a dog fighting ring where 50 dogs were taken from his house. And this is a huge turning point in the coverage of pit bulls in America. And part of this, as Professor Kim discusses in her book, is from pit bulls going from kind of the partner in crime of African Americans, this racialized menace, to pit bulls being the victims of African Americans. And that helps change the overall imaging and the overall opinion. We'll talk about how this pit bulls become deracialized in the last few years. All right, so this pit bull positivity comes in a lot of forms. One place where it doesn't come still is the news media. This is the share of all stories about pit bulls over the last decade or so. Trends a little bit down, but it's pretty consistently way, way, way more negative than it is positive. Pit bull negativity in news coverage is the norm. Pit bulls are covered much more negatively than any other of these major dog breeds. Even dogs that are racialized and are thought to be scary, like Rottweilers, are covered far less negatively. This is the net sentiment, means this is the share of positive stories minus the share of negative stories. Now, the share of news stories that are violent, also 60% of all stories about pit bulls have some references to their violent nature in them, and that the volume of this, and so this is what we would call tone, kind of the share of stories, but volume is the amount of stories. And what you can see is that there's so many more. These are negative stories, these are violent stories. So many more stories about pit bulls. Pit bulls make news in ways that other breeds don't. And so when you have pit bulls being overwhelmingly shown as violent and negative by the news media, that's hard, and that takes a concerted effort to combat. And that's where social media has really come in. So the same tool that is able to analyze every news story is able to do that for every tweet and every Instagram post. And what we can see is net sentiment of tweets, they're all positive. News has an inherent negativity bias in it. You only tend to report on bad shit. But you're only taking to Twitter and especially Instagram to post like awesome pictures of dogs. And so these are overwhelmingly positive posts about dogs, pit bulls here on Twitter, on Instagram. And just as the negativity of pit bulls in news is magnified by volume or the sheer amount, same is true in social media. And so there are just a lot more tweets, and this is even after removing any tweet that mentions Pitbull the rapper. So we're also able to do this. So yes, I've had that question before. No, these do not contain Pitbull the rapper in them. But Pitbull's volume of positive tweets in the millions, 1.5 million, almost 3 times as many as the next highest breed of golden retrievers. And pit bulls, in terms of Instagram, over 3 million positive tweets. Again, the most positive Instagram posts. So just like you have this influx of negativity on news and pop culture from the 1980s through the 2000s, social media has come around and has provided this remarkable outlet for pit bull positivity. And this corresponds with growing support for pit bulls in the U.S. So these are 2 YouGov surveys that we did, and this is 2014 compared to 2018. And you see on average about an 8-point increase in various questions like would consider adopting a pit bull safe for neighborhoods, etc. So you see this growing support. Also growing support in the UK. And this is over time from 2013 to 2014, a pretty notable increase in support for pit bulls. We, however, wanted to test this more definitively to see, okay, you show somebody pit bull positivity, how is this going to affect views? But we also wanted to do this racialized pit bull positivity. And so remember, pit bull negativity through the news media is often racialized as black. And that leads to negative support for pit bulls. But on social media, like when we look at these, I don't know if you follow any pit bull websites on social media. If you don't, you should follow Pit Bulls of Instagram because they are awesome. Follow the dodo. But as awesome as those sites are, they do racialize pit bull positivity in a way that tends to have a white face on it. So we said, all right, we want to test this. We want to show people this image of racialized pit bull positivity, and we will see what it says. So I'll show you this quick video, 1-minute video that we showed a bunch of people. So, yes, cute. Oops. Okay, so lots of cuteness there, but that cuteness was serving a social science purpose. And in particular, we're looking at what are known as counter-stereotypical cues. And so if you remember from that slide I showed 20 minutes ago or so, where people stereotype pit bull owners as African Americans, what happens when you associate pit bulls, like this pitty is the biggest snuggler and showing that pit bulls really are the sweetest? What happens when you associate that with a young white girl? And there's a lot of expectations based upon social science research. And so one of the things that we know is that counter-stereotypical images can reduce prejudice. And so if you are inclined to think about things in a stereotypical way, kind of changing that frame away can decrease prejudice. Counter-stereotypical cues and messages can also dampen the effects of racial attitudes and race. And so one thing that's often done in experimental studies is they show images of kind of counter-stereotypical that go against the stereotypes of most Americans, such as deserving African Americans, white criminals, and white welfare recipients. These studies have shown that they can deactivate racial attitudes, making them less important. One of the things that I did in my research was showing that shifting Obama's policies to white Democrats deactivated racial attitudes and such. And so we're going to look at what the effect of that experiment is. So a little background, I surveyed 2,000 people. I said half of those people, that video that you just saw, and the other half of the sample got a dodo video of a Dalmatian messing with somebody's yoga. And this is what the effects were. And so this is white Americans here. The gray is the Dalmatian dodo video. The black is the pit bull dodo video. And for white Americans, if you saw the Dalmatian video, this is their rating of pit bulls, they rated pit bulls 23. Showing them that video that I just showed you, that 1 minute, increased their net rating of pit bulls by 15 percentage points. That is a huge, huge impact of pit bull positivity. But notably for African Americans who started off rating pit bulls higher than whites, they actually decreased. And so this decreases kind of the racial divide in pit bulls. It makes pit bulls more popular with white Americans by showing them this racialized white pit bull positivity, but it does lower the opinions of African Americans. And so that is kind of an important phenomenon that's happening right now, and it applies to a lot of different issues. When a policy gets a white face attached to it, such as, whether it's white opioid users or white pit bull owners, you do see white support tend to increase. The interesting thing here, though, is that you see African American support decrease. Last thing I want to talk about is the role of socialization. It's something we've talked about a lot here, and about how important it is to change attitudes among the youth. And so pit bull politics is really important when it comes to socialization. We expect young adults to be particularly influenced by changes in images and narratives about pit bulls. And this goes back to what we talked about last week in terms of impressionable years hypothesis, where, things like Trump and Black Lives Matter movement, they're going to matter a lot more for your generation's opinions than mine, because my opinions are already formed. But for younger people who are being socialized now, that has a big influence, and that deals with impressionable years hypothesis. Impressionable years hypothesis is really important in this class because when young people change their opinions, that has generational replacement kick in. The older folks die, the younger, less prejudiced folks replace them. We learned about all this stuff last week, that late adolescents and young adults are particularly open to changing their early acquired socio-political attitudes. And because there's been such a dramatic change in the portraits of pit bulls from the pit bull panic era through this era of racialized white social media, pit bull positivity, we'd expect young people to have much different views than older people. We talked about this last week when we did racial stasis and the fact that young people's views on race and racial resentment from 1988 to 2012 weren't that different. We didn't see much change at all in racial attitudes during that time. We also talked a lot last week about how BLM and Trump helped end the stagnation in racial attitudes of the young. Again, impressionable years hypothesis, exposure to salient events can socialize attitudes that are unique. BLM and Trump make it harder for youth to turn a blind eye to realities of racism. And then we had this graph showing that because of the events of the last 5-6 years, you've seen a big age gap start to open up in racial attitudes, racial resentment, where young people are now at the vanguard, meaning they're at the forefront of liberalizing attitudes towards the group. That's what happens when images, narratives, events change things. Young people are the first to move, and move the most, because their attitudes are still the most in flux. And this is exactly what's happening with pit bulls right now. You are having huge effects of age. Age, more than any other factor, predicts public opinion towards pit bulls. And these are a bunch of different questions. And the oldest fogies consistently are about 60 percentage points less supportive of pit bulls than people your age. And this all stems from the nature of socialization. Your generation has been socialized not to think of pit bulls as a menace that needs to be controlled, or else they're going to wreak havoc and start mauling little children. You've been raised on social media to think, okay, pit bulls are cool. This graph here similarly shows This is percent who rate dog breeds favorably. This is for every other major breed, and it doesn't matter if you're old or young, like 80% support, have a favorable view of breeds like Collies and German Shepherds, Dalmatians, Labs. But for Pit Bulls, forget about it. The youngest are like, yeah, I'm on board with them just as much as any other dog breed. But then that older generation completely falls out. That is the nature of socialization. Young people in many ways are products of their time. And if your time is telling you that pit bulls are monsters, well, you're going to form those attitudes, and they're going to be very difficult to change throughout your lifespan. That is the same with racial ethnic prejudice. How events deal with you now, how you're socialized, has a big impact. And then once you get to my age and you're around 40, those are pretty well set in place. And this has major implications, just as attitude change about racial, ethnic, LGBTQ groups that we've talked about that have big age divides do. Eventually, these people will die, they will be replaced by them, and it will continue this upward trajectory of public support for pit bulls, much the way that you see prejudice towards African Americans, immigrants, Islam, LGBTQ groups, particularly right now transgender groups. That prejudice is on the decline, and it's being driven by young people who are socialized in a different environment than their parents. And when that happens, then you start to see the changes in laws come around. You see the changes in how elites talk about things. And so, this isn't quite on the level of Barack Obama changing his opinion and saying that same-sex marriage should be legal. But why does Obama move in 2012 to come out in support of same-sex marriage? Well, because the country had moved, and his position saying that same-sex marriage should not be the same as opposite-sex marriage is no longer a politically tenable position to take. And that's actually what's happening a bit with pit bulls right now. And so Obama comes out against dog breed-specific legislation, joins the fight for pit bulls. This punk, Gavin Newsom, I do not like him. He's not my guy. The reason he's not my guy is because when he was mayor of San Francisco, he had a ban on pit bulls. He was a big anti-pit bull person. But then you had groups, when he was running for governor, this is pit bulls saying no to Gavin Newsom. And you have all this energy now saying, Newsom, you're a piece of shit for wanting to ban pit bulls. Then he does this pit bull maneuver. Lieutenant Governor Newsom apparently pivots on breed-specific legislation stance. When he ran for governor, he was no longer supportive of a pit bull ban. And that's how laws change. And so, yes, this example of pit bulls probably isn't the most salient, most important in the world to you, but it has parallels to other laws that probably are. Things like same-sex marriage, things like policing reform, things like voting rights reform. In the 2020 election, Denver, who was one of the earliest banners of pit bulls, who had such a horribly discriminatory practice where they killed hundreds of thousands of pit bulls in Denver, finally reversed its pit bull ban in 2020 election. That is the changing nature of the times. And so that is the similar upward trajectory that we are seeing right now in racial attitudes. The big difference, of course, is that there's no unified voice of opposition against the growing liberalization of pit bull attitudes and pit bull laws, the way that there always is going to be this strong opposition towards racial equality. That's the difference between psychological natured prejudice and structural prejudice. Psychologically based nature of prejudice is a lot easier to change. You change the images, you change the narratives, you shift the stereotypes, and you can do a lot of work. And you're not going to face the same level of opposition to those efforts because the stakes of keeping the status quo aren't the same. When it comes to structural based racism, though, things like am I going to actually bring about inequality? I mean, am I going to actually bring about measures that reduce inequality? Well, then that gets lots of opposition from people who benefit from the racial status quo. That makes things a lot easier. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh, you just got to change the attitudes. That's an easy thing. No, it's a lot easier to change attitudes about pit bulls than it is to change attitudes about race and ethnicity. But there are still some parallels that can be drawn in important ways. And that leads us to pit bull positivity conclusions. Pit bull positivity does indeed follow familiar patterns of prejudice reduction. Changing images lead to more positive opinions. Changing images create sharp cohort or sharp age effects between groups who are socialized in one environment versus groups who are socialized in another environment. That is probably the most important parallel between racial attitudes and pit bull attitudes, is this socialization and these age effects. Racialized pit bull positivity. Pit bull positivity, unlike pit bull negativity, tends to have a white face. White pit bull positivity reduces the racial divide over the breed. And so lots of parallels between things we learned in the class. And then the MVPs, the inspiration for this all, our sweet dogs, Piglet, Dumpling, Piglet, Trey. We hope you get to see them. Trey's going to be coming to campus with me pretty much every day when we're able to come back, and I hope you get to meet him. I enjoyed engaging with you. This is my favorite class to teach. Sorry that we didn't get to meet in person, because it is a good space where we can talk about these real issues in an honest way that's often not discussed. So I hope to continue the conversation. I hope to see you. Thanks for humoring me and putting up with these lectures from my living room. Bye, everybody.